The American Disaster Preparedness Foundation did a study of the major metropolitan areas around the country, and unfortunately the Midwest scored the lowest. We actually had the most inadequate preparation in the Midwest, although Chicago, I'll say the city of Chicago, actually did fairly well. It got a C+, and that was because they actually had some pretty good training around the potential for a disaster, but not specifically around a nuclear reactor accident or with the appropriate equipment.
This is the 20th anniversary of the Chernobyl nuclear reactor accident in Russia. In light of this, we are going to hear from Dr. Andrew Kanter from the Physicians for Social Responsibility in Chicago. He will talk about the situation regarding our own reactors in Illinois. Dr. Kanter?
Thank you. So welcome everybody, and I appreciate your effort to come here in this room so you can have an experience on this, the 20th anniversary of the Chernobyl accident. I'll apologize a little bit in advance. I just recovering from surgery on my back, so if I can't be held accountable for anything I might say during this time, but I'll try to stay lucid for you all. But Physicians for Social Responsibility is an organization, actually it's a national organization that has about 35,000 members, physicians, other healthcare workers, and concerned citizens. We're mostly focused on education and advocacy about nuclear issues, issues about violence, as well as environmental impacts to survival. I'm going to focus today pretty much on the nuclear issue. So tonight, I'm going to start with giving you a little bit of an introduction, some background, specifically in the context of experiences that we've recently had with Katrina, the Hurricane Katrina and Rita, and the climate of fear that we are currently living in, and the opportunities that we have for actually making a change. Really, tonight's topic is focusing on specifically nuclear power plant security and safety, both the possibility of nuclear power plants being a target for terrorism, as well as the possibility of an accident, and specifically the medical consequences that such a accident or attack would have for here in Chicago, the Braidwood nuclear reactor, which is just southwest of here. And then, of course, I'm going to try to end with some very specific examples of what we can do and concerns that we might want to be bringing up for a policy discussion. So I start with this quote because I think it's always important, and it's that the splitting of the atom changed everything save our modes of thinking, and thus we drift towards unparalleled catastrophe. And what Albert Einstein was saying there was that in this world we live in now, this new nuclear world, that there are all sorts of threats, all sorts of paths that might lead us to destruction, and that unless we really change the way we think about things in light of those consequences of our actions, that was the direction that we're going to be heading in. So what I'm going to talk about today really is, what are some of the things that we can do to possibly change the path that we're on. Now, Katrina, if I had given this talk, a year ago, I wouldn't have been able to have a reference point like Hurricane Katrina, which really, for all of us, was a wake-up call on several different fronts. As you probably are aware, this was a catastrophe on a scale unparalleled within the United States in terms of the numbers of people who were affected, the property damage, and also sort of the poor response of our government to actually protecting the population. Now, we've long known that accidents could happen. And I've talked about in the past nuclear accidents in particular, but we've always had to rely on the fact that the government, quote unquote, would take care of us or would be able to respond to those kinds of accidents. What we've seen is that, and in the reports that have come out of the Katrina and Rita experience, is that the government is not prepared. And so what I'm going to really talk to you today is about what this experience has taught us, specifically around the likelihood of a nuclear accident here in Chicago and what we might learn about it. Now, again, Physicians for Social Responsibility began in the 1960s. We were part of the Nobel Peace Prize winning organization, the International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War, specifically because we educated about the dangers of nuclear weapons and nuclear war. What we're talking about here is another nuclear issue, and there is a connection between global climate change with Hurricane Katrina, nuclear power, and nuclear proliferation. I'm going to focus today on the nuclear power part of this, but really the greatest threat that is facing our population and the world and ecosystem right now is ultimately the threat of a nuclear weapon going off, or the use of a nuclear or terrorist attack against a nuclear plant releasing radioactive materials. So in the context of that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about nuclear power. So first of all, right now there's about 104 operating nuclear power plants in the United States. There's about 36 non-power reactors that are in universities and use highly enriched uranium. Here in Illinois, we actually have the most reactors of any state in the Union. We're the most nuclear state, with 11 actually all right here around northern Illinois, potentially affecting Chicago. And as you can see on the map, we're going to be talking specifically about the Braidwood reactors here, but then there's also the Dresden and LaSalle reactors. Now, there's a lot of talk that nuclear power is going to be the solution to global warming. Now, what we know here is that right now, nuclear power makes up about 8% of the nation's power grid. It is not a major source of electricity for the United States. And what I'm going to hopefully try to explain to you is that the risks of nuclear power is specifically around both the safety and the security and the storage of nuclear waste makes this not the right choice for our energy security. A little background, there are really two different types of nuclear power plants in the United States that we are affecting, that affect us. On the left side here is the boiling water reactors, and if you'll notice here that the water that is used for cooling the reactor here circulates around, powers the steam, powers the turbine, generates electricity. In the example of the pressurized water reactor, which is actually this is like the Dresden reactor, the pressurized water reactor, which is like the Braidwood reactor, has a different cycle where the actual radioactive water usually stays here within the core, and the cooling water is a separate link. But we also know the recent tritium links from the Braidwood reactors is that nuclear power plants create all sorts of different kinds of radioactivity. It doesn't all just stay in this loop right here. The important thing I think really to note here is that how critical water is to nuclear power, and that's why nuclear power plants are pretty much situated either on rivers or near lakes, because they require a great deal of water to stay cool. Now, in addition to the nuclear plant itself, the core of the reactor, which like the core that exploded and released radioactivity in Chernobyl, also contains a great deal of radioactivity that are stored in cooling ponds actually on the site around the nuclear reactors themselves. Now, these spent fuel storage areas are typically contain massive amounts of radioactivity because they take many copies essentially of the fuel that are in the reactors, and after about 1 to 2 years they're actually put out into these cooling ponds for storage. Now, so as I mentioned here, that this is somewhere around 10 times amount of radiation that's actually within the core itself, which is somewhere in the order of 20 to 50 million curies of radioactivity. If you think about the Chernobyl accident, that released only 2 million curies, so we're talking about 10 times to 20, 30 times that amount of radioactivity that are in these storage pools. Now, if you notice, these pools, it's unlike the reactor core, which has this very thick cement dome over it to protect the reactor. These typically are just submerged underwater, and in the buildings that are somewhat, along the construction of, let's say, a Kmart, they're a lightly constructed steel and girder type buildings, clearly not as secure from a terrorism attack or a plane crash, for example, as the core itself. And the type of covering in this case is not one that would protect at all from any release of radiation. So, come on in. Nuclear plant security. So let me talk a little bit about the context of plants, not just in terms of their accidents, but in terms of the possibility of their use by a terrorist for purposes of creating havoc. As I mentioned before, that the core itself is protected by a containment dome. Now, this dome is several feet thick and is actually a pretty good protection against the outside world. Now, there hasn't been very many studies, and certainly not that has ever proven that the core itself would be protected from an accident along the lines of what happened at the World Trade Center. You know, a jumbo jet flying into these nuclear plants. These plants are often situated very close to the airports or on flight paths, so this is not an unreasonable expectation. We also mentioned, as you noticed earlier, that the plants themselves are very dependent upon the coolant. And as a matter of fact, I don't know if you knew that during the heat waves that were in France just this last year, or actually 2003, that the water temperature in the rivers got so hot that they actually had to shut off the nuclear power plants because the water wasn't cool enough to keep the power plants cooled down. So water is critical, and any disruption of that water is also a potential disaster for the core itself. Now, the spent fuel ponds that I just mentioned before, because we have no real permanent storage for nuclear waste, as we know now, or you may not know, that the Yucca Mountain proposal is still quite controversial and does not even cover all of the nuclear waste that we have right now. Most of this waste is being stored on site in these pools. Now, originally the pools were designed to only hold, you know, these fuel for maybe, you know, a couple of years after the reactor had been emptied. They're now having to store fuel up 30, 40 years worth. So what they've done is pack them very tightly inside these coolant pools to try to maintain the storage facilities. But that also means that they're overcrowded and potentially vulnerable, again, to if any loss of that water, for them to be exposed to fire and heat. Now, after 9/11, there was a lot of concern about security on nuclear power plants, and you would think that that would be a rational response. But what happened actually was that there was some minor increases in security that had occurred afterwards, and there really was no significant change in the plant security or those around the spent fuel ponds. So we're here talking about a power plant containing a great deal of radioactive material, both in the plant itself and in the storage ponds. And we're potentially vulnerable either for accident or for terrorism. So before I go in and actually tell you what the scenario is going to be about the accident, I need to give you a little bit of information about what radiation is. And I know that, you know, a lot of people already know a lot about radiation, so I'm not going to spend a great deal of time about it. But one thing that's very important to realize, and particularly this has come out fairly recently with some very strong publications, that is that there is no safe level of radiation. Okay, it's not. We're not sure if it's a linear dose response or not, but we do know that there is no threshold. There is no quote-unquote safe level of radiation. Every person has a certain risk if they are exposed to radiation. Each cell has a certain risk of becoming a malignant cell, developing cancer, etc. And that when we talk about populations of people being exposed to radiation, very small doses can have effects in populations because they're multiplied by multiple people. So when we start at the very low end of the spectrum, even low doses can have genetic consequences. We know that. We can slightly higher doses affect the bone marrow in our bodies, the rapidly turning over cells, the white blood cells that help us fight infection, the blood cells that help us carry oxygen, our hair cells, the cells that line our gut. These are cells in our body that are rapidly growing and changing, and therefore they're highly susceptible to basically having damage to that sort of process of dividing from radiation. The higher and higher the doses of radiation you get, the more and more damage to these cells, ultimately leading to the point that you either die from loss of fluids and disruption of all of the organ systems of your body, or due to loss of all of those white blood cell counts, just as like patients who've gone through chemotherapy, they're exposed to infectious disease and they can die very easily. So we talk about, biological and genetic effects on one end, all the way up to almost certain death for doses above about 600 rem. Now, radiation sickness, I'm going to talk a little bit about radiation sickness when we talk about numbers. Now, the thing about radiation sickness is it's not very pleasant. Okay, so I mean, it's certainly not something anyone wants to experience. The thing about it is also that there's no way to know whether the radiation sickness is due to a dose that only produced the sort of the nausea, the vomiting, the diarrhea, and I could survive given the right amount of supportive care, from someone who's actually had over 600 rem, let's say, and they're going to have the same kind of radiation sickness, but they're going to die. Which means there's no way to sort of triage or think about this. Many people who are going to feel sick are going to think they've had a lethal dose or a very strong dose of radiation. And that means that the amount of the population that are going to be seeking help in the case of any sort of radioactive exposure is going to be very high. And that will, we'll talk specifically about that in a moment. So let me talk a little bit about the specifics. This is a proposal or scenario that the Physicians for Social Responsibility, also the Union of Concerned Scientists, have run with various nuclear power plants around the country under different kinds of scenarios. So what we're talking about here is Braidwood. It's about 50 miles or so southwest of Chicago. It's a pressurized water reactor, as I showed you before, which has some implications in terms of the possible breach of the containment vessel, the need for high pressures for the coolant supply and so on. But it's more important to say that we're anticipating two different kind of scenarios here at Braidwood. One will be a reactor vessel breach. And what we're anticipating here is either through an accident a la Chernobyl or a direct, deliberate attempt at disrupting the coolant leads to a complete meltdown of the plant, breach of the containment vessel, release of a large plume of radioactivity. The second scenario is a spent fuel pond fire. As I mentioned before, the possibility of a small plane, for example, could easily penetrate these ponds. The disruption of that coolant, which is actually much actually more important, but at a much more vulnerable level, could expose the coolant, nuclear power reactor assemblies. They overheat, they actually catch fire, and they burn for several days, releasing the radioactive material. Now, the way we do this is we actually use two different tools, and these are the same tools that the government uses. So, you know, either believe us or don't, but at least both of us are using the same tools. The first is this program called HPAC, which is the Hazard Prediction Assessment Capability, and this is used by the Defense Threat Reduction Agency to actually model what the kind of nuclear, biological, or chemical contamination or releases would be for various kinds of scenarios. We combine that data with something that's called CATS, which is the Consequence Assessment Tool set from FEMA. And this actually helps us plan, if it doesn't help them plan, but it helps us plan what are the effects on the actual infrastructure in our society, things like doctors, hospitals, police, fire, and so on. So let's get into the scenario. Catastrophic coolant failure, breach of the containment dome, loss of the core with a meltdown. 4% an hour means that over about a period of a day, the entire core would have been vaporized and lead to a plume or a cloud, which would then, depending on the wind, would travel, assuming it's a summer day, somewhat quite warmer than today, with normal temperatures and broken clouds. So this is a map of what that plume would look like on one particular case of the situation. Now, it's a little hard to see right here. You know, here's the city of Chicago. This right here is the reactor. Here is the city of Joliet. Here's South Bend. Here's Fort Wayne. And the different colors represent the different exposure levels over a period of about 72 hours for that plume to move. Now, the different colors also tell us what the likely exposure levels are. Now, the scenario that we used uses census data from 1990, which means it's probably, we know it's out of date, so these numbers are quite a bit lower than it would probably be in real life. But what we see right here is that at least about 1,750 people were going to receive what we call the LD50 dose, which is probably a lethal dose, 50% chance of actually dying from the lethal dose. Those are people that are, you know, are situated very close to the reactor itself. We have about 20,000 people where they would receive significant doses of radiation, probably in the 200 rem area, where they're likely to get very sick and likely to die. Another 200,000 people would actually be suffering from those cases of acute radiation sickness that I described earlier, quite uncomfortable with hair falling out and vomiting and nausea and diarrhea. And then on top of that, you've got this area here, which is, it's a little hard to see. I'll show you in the next slide a little bit easier. But this larger area here are those people that would basically exposed to enough radiation to exceed their entire annual occupational dose. No, in other words, if I was a nuclear plant reactor, there's a different level of dose that the government says is safe for me to experience during my year of working in a nuclear power plant. Now, what we're saying here is that 4.5 million people would be exposed in that day and a half or 2 days to the amount of radiation that a radiation worker would be allowed to expose in an entire year. So that's, those again, is a significant amount of radiation, low on the grand scheme of things, but when you're talking about 4.5 million, 5 million people, that's a significant amount. Now, here's another map, and this is looking at it a little bit differently. So the map I showed you was the radiation exposure from breathing in the dose of radiation or the radiation that occurs from the plume itself. But we can also look at what sort of the acute reaction is, or the acute dose of the radiation. And here, it's a slightly different kind of view of this. We still see that there's about 200,000 people with acute radiation sickness. I mean, we can't even deal with a bus or a train crash that may send 100 people to a hospital. We're talking 200,000 people with acute radiation sickness. We're talking here about 4.5 million people with a dose of 5 rem. Now, 5 rem is about the equivalent of, I'd say 50 or so chest x-rays at one time. Okay, so it's not a meaningless amount of radiation. It's a fairly significant amount. And the area here you see in sort of dark brown, kind of orange color, is actually the area for which the Environmental Protection Agency has set as the either shelter or evacuation zone requirements. So this is the dose level. So it's much less than the 5 rem, and it's going to be the kind of dose where they're going to say, look, in that area, we make sure that everyone has to get out. So we're talking about 6.5 million people would have to be evacuated.
Where?
And the question is where and when, how to make sure that they don't go this way. You want them to go that way if they're going to go. So this is the kind of thing that we're going to talk a little bit about preparedness. What you see here is that this is like Katrina in terms of scale, in terms of evacuation requirement and the people affected. But we're talking not about several thousand people being killed. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. And it's a significant risk to our society. Now, what does this really mean? First of all, as I said before, our system is not prepared for anything like this at all. The numbers of people who are acutely ill, those people who are going to die, and those people who need supportive help are going to overwhelm any kind of medical care facilities that we have in this area. Not to mention, if you look at this, that there's 113 hospitals that are actually in the plume. So not only do we have the people that we have to have them treated somewhere, but what about all the people in the hospital that have to be moved somewhere else and be treated by some other people? So we're talking about 32,000 beds basically being taken away from our capacity in the hospitals by the accident itself. Now, as a physician, I may be all altruistic, and I might want to put myself at risk, to help people. But here we're talking about 20,000 doctors being in that plume and actually receiving a dose that would basically take them out of being able to care for people. So like the liquidators in Chernobyl that have certain amounts of dose, they can only go in for a certain amount of time, you got 20,000 doctors who aren't going to be able to treat anybody because they've already experienced the massive dose of radiation themselves. They're going to it's like working in the X-ray machine, they have to stay away now. So this puts a huge burden on our ability to actually deal with this. Now, we think about physicians in hospitals. They're concentrated, in the urban areas and likely would be affected by this. But on the other side of it, think about the police and the fire. I mean, they're the people, like in Hurricane Katrina, that we really are going to depend upon to help us here. Now, the people who are exposed right around Braidwood, like the 25 people who work at the fire station in Essex County, they are going to receive lethal doses or potentially lethal doses of radiation. Okay, they're not going to be in any position to be helping people. The 67 firefighters who are in Braidwood and Herscher fire departments are also going to be likely to be sick. So, again, they're going to have to bring in people from the outside to take care of this because the people who are actually in those communities themselves are not going to be available. Like the 10,500 firefighters in 355 other departments are all basically going to have their, the radiation badges or whatever exceeded. They're basically not going to be able to stay. They're going to have to be evacuated with everybody else, which means who's going to be there in the society to take care of the people who are still there. So this is a pretty dramatic and drastic situation. And we have 11 of these reactors around Chicago and certainly within the plume character polarization that I just described you. And if you notice from that earlier map that the plume extended quite a bit farther. Matter of fact, it extended over the lake, which means that if these reactors were even farther away from us, Chicago would still be affected by the plumes. Not to mention, you've got to imagine all that radiation being dumped in the lake, which is our water supply. And so this doesn't even take anything into account, all the radiation that might possibly be incorporated through the water supply. Now, a nuclear plant accident is fairly rare. I mean, Chernobyl was clearly the worst disaster that in the history of mankind, but there are, the possibility of terrorism, as I mentioned before, and so on. Where the other scenario I'm going to talk to you about now is something that is potentially much smaller, but also is much more likely, because all that additional radiation that I mentioned earlier stored in these spent fuel ponds actually around the reactors themselves. Zion, right up north of us on the lake, as well as the 11 reactors, all carry these spent fuel ponds. Now, unfortunately, our software is somewhat limited here, and we can only model 3 assemblies being destroyed. Now, these assemblies, may be so big. Typically, a fire, like an airplane flying into one of these things, loss of coolant, would, 10 times this number of assemblies would be likely destroyed and burned. But just this kind of gives you an idea of what we're talking about. The assemblies themselves contain cesium-137. And I didn't really go into much about the specific different radionuclides that would come from the plant. You're probably aware of like iodine, and when an active nuclear power plant ruptures like Chernobyl, what you would do is you have a great deal of release of radioactive iodine in the air, which concentrates in the thyroid glands of particularly kids and pregnant women who are susceptible to radiation. But cesium-137 is not as easily transmitted. It's not like a gas like the iodine, but it stays highly radioactive and is like potassium, and concentrates in muscles and produces cancer and so on. So same situation, summer day, normal temperatures, broken clouds. Well, before I go into this, it's like, well, what's the likelihood? Aren't we going to protect ourselves from terrorism or an accident in the spent fuel ponds? Well, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission actually was sort of broached with this problem and said, look, this is a terrorism risk. It's very easily accessible. We've got a Walmart-like building on top of a roof on top of these things. What's to protect us? And their response was, well, we don't need to worry about it, because the possibility of a terrorist attack against these spent fuel ponds is quote unquote speculative and simply too far removed from the natural or expected consequences of their agency action. And therefore, there really has been no change at all to security for these spent fuel ponds. So, I'm sure that the World Trade Center was not something that was natural or expected for that particular situation. So this is a real risk. And one of the things I think, as we talk about ways that we can prepare ourselves or minimize the risks, we can deal with it. Now, as you can see, the plume is a much smaller exposure. We still have hundreds to thousands of people being exposed as well as sick. The amount of radiation is much lower, but it can continue to meet all the way up to Chicago. We still have, in tens of thousands of people would have to be evacuated from the spent fuel pond fires. And I can imagine that, typically, as I mentioned earlier, this would be on the orders of 30 times the size, or 10 to 30 times the size of the one I just modeled. Now, I've talked to you a little bit about Braidwood. I've talked to you about these spent fuel ponds. We have other examples. The Union of Concerned Scientists did a study. The Indian Point nuclear reactor, which is just south of, or just north of Manhattan, they did a study that said, well, if the same situation had happened there in that reactor like the ones here near Chicago, they would anticipate there could be somewhere between 3,500 to 44,000 immediate deaths due to the radiation, and that the likely exposure to that population would lead to 100 to 500,000 long-term additional deaths from cancer. So this is a substantial amount of morbidity and mortality associated with this. This is an example for New York. I mean, we're Chicago. We may not care about New York, but it is something that we do need to think about ourselves. The economic damage, like Chernobyl, there was huge areas that were no longer habitable that had to be evacuated. If that should happen here in Chicago or like here in New York City, the likely economic consequences are extravagant, ranging in the $1 to $2 trillion range for not only the cleanup but also the damage to the economy. So I've kind of painted a kind of an ugly picture. You know, these nuclear power plants, we've got 104 of them around the country. Some of them, 11 of them are very close to us here in Chicago. Well, are we prepared? Well, the answer to that question is no. Now, we've gotten several different reports about this, certainly after Katrina, where there was a real assessment of the nation's preparedness. We know that up to this point, we've done a really poor job of doing that. The American Disaster Preparedness Foundation did a study of the major metropolitan areas around the country, and unfortunately, the Midwest scored the lowest. We actually had the most inadequate preparation in the Midwest, although Chicago, I'll say the city of Chicago, actually did fairly well. It got a C+, and that was because they actually had some pretty good training around the potential for a disaster, but not specifically around a nuclear reactor accident or with the appropriate equipment. So they only got a C+. Now, typically, Physicians for Social Responsibility comes in and they tell you, well, I mean, we can't survive this. I mean, you know, it's 8 million people having to be evacuated, hundreds of thousands of people being radiation sick, you know, like the Indian Point, hundreds of thousands of people dying. There's no way we can adequately prepare for this. The only treatment for this kind of a disease is really prevention. So I want to start by saying we need to prevent this, and I'll touch on this at the end, but we also need to have common sense. And the common sense says, well, in the unlikely situation that this does happen, or one of the lower probability situations, we should be prepared. So what do we need to do to be prepared? Well, we've learned a lot from Katrina, and we've learned a lot from Chernobyl. And that is that we need central coordination. We do depend upon the federal government to help us here. Now, Chicago, actually the plants around Chicago, are ringed by biological or radioactive monitoring devices. Now, this is actually critical because one of the first things we need to know is, A, has an accident actually occurred? And, you know, the Chernobyl accident, no one was told about it for 2 days. We know that the tritiated water leak that occurred down in the Braidwood, we didn't hear about for 10 years. So we really want to make sure that, A, we have to find out if this is going to happen immediately. And because the majority of the injuries from a reactor accident as opposed to like a nuclear bomb is due to the radiation, we have to protect people from that radioactive cloud, which means they either have to get out of the way or they have to shelter. They actually have to make sure that they don't go outside. You can imagine what would happen if it looked like Katrina with everyone lined up on the highways just waiting and having that cloud go right over the top of everybody. I mean, that would be like the worst case scenario. So that means that not only do we need to know that there's been an accident, we need to know where it is, which way the wind's blowing, and somebody has to be there to say, well, do you evacuate? Do you shelter? Okay? This means that we need to educate people about what they're going to have to do. They need to understand what the risks are if they're going to live downwind of a nuclear power plant so that they can actually do the right thing if something should happen. So education, the use of potassium iodine, we talked about this in a previous NEIS discussion, but the ability to block the radioactive iodine from concentrating in the thyroid glands means you have to know, actually before the accident happens, to take it. Well, but the idea being is it needs to be taken as soon as possible after the accident, which means, again, it needs to be available. People need to be educated about their use of it. And more importantly, the societies, the communities need to understand what the plan is. Now, the one thing that Chicago got docked highly in this analysis in the National Safety or Preparedness study was that nobody knows what the evacuation plans are. They may be there, but none of the local community responders know about it, and certainly the people don't understand what it is, and therefore we can't expect that they're really going to do the right thing. So monitoring and more transparency about what the real risks of this are so that we can be prepared. I talked a little bit before about the surge capacity of the hospitals. I think if anyone's done a trip to the hospital, and I just myself came back from one, they're pretty full most of the time. Okay, the emergency rooms aren't exactly, there are people waiting in the emergency room for beds to open up inside the hospitals, which means any kind of situation like this, as I mentioned before, even a bus accident, we don't know what to do with people. So our system is so badly stretched right now that in the case of an accident, there's no place that we're going to be able to put these people. The ability to put in mobile hospitals and so on clearly failed during the Katrina experience, and has proven to us again that to better prepare ourselves, we need public health infrastructure. We need to improve our own healthcare system so that there is the capacity to handle things that happen outside of the quote-unquote norms. Disaster medical assistant teams. These are actually sort of like MASH units, or the kinds of doctors that would show up in the situation like the National Guard to help people. We don't have enough of them. You know, there were people certainly down in Louisiana who could have benefited from these teams when the teams weren't there, or the teams were over in Connecticut and they weren't available. I mean, all sorts of things, or in Iraq. So one of the things is we need better response teams. The teams that are here, the people that are going to have to respond in these kind of situations, need better training. They need to have more equipment, and they need to have, essentially improved responsiveness to these kinds of scenarios. So these are things that we can demand. I mean, Department of Homeland Security, where does that money get spent? What kinds of the investments are we making in our society? Are we improving our safety and security? Are we building the infrastructure in these kinds of situations, or are we not? I think those are questions that we certainly can ask our elected officials. Ultimately, what I'm talking about here, though, is risks that far exceed the benefits. And as I started with this earlier, that we're dealing with 8% of the power supply in the United States. Nuclear power plants represent by themselves not only a threat in terms of terrorism and potential safety issues, but they're sending a message about proliferation. We're saying that it's okay for the United States to produce waste that we don't know what to do with, waste that's going to spend fuel ponds that might be a target of attack, or could potentially be the target of being sidetracked into a proliferation risk. Now, the United States government and the administration says, well, we need nuclear power to deal with the global climate change. Global climate change is a big problem, no question about it. And I'm not going to get into the whole talk about why nuclear power plants don't work for global climate change. But what I can tell you is that the likelihood that any amount of effort to reduce global climate change would require somewhere, I think, the plans of another 800 nuclear reactors around the country to get a significant drop in the carbon production even for that. And that'll take 20 years or so even before those reactors are built, which means we're not talking about 11 reactors around here. We're talking about 50 reactors around here, each with their potential risks. Now, the question is do we have an alternative? And the answer is yes. And there are other ways for us to generate electricity and eliminate the risk for global climate change. So what can we do about this? First thing is to get educated. So it's great that you're all here, and it's nice that CAN TV is here to help us share this with the rest of the world. We need to be able to talk to people. We need to say that there are alternatives, that we do not need to be forced into a nuclear renaissance. We do have to recognize that these are our communities and that we cannot properly prepare ourselves for these accidents, and therefore, ultimately, we need to deal with this risk. How do we do that? One thing is we stop producing nuclear materials. Okay? We stop producing the nuclear waste. We stop producing nuclear weapons and so on. Now, these need to be put somewhere safe. Yucca Mountain is not safe. There isn't even enough space in Yucca Mountain to deal with all the waste that's in the nuclear power plants now, let alone the 800 nuclear power plants that the administration would like to build. Therefore, we have a problem with nuclear materials. We can begin the process. I'm not saying like immediately let's turn off the switches on Braidwood. But we need to be thinking about how can we phase out these plants, find a place to put that waste on site in a secure fashion, get them out of these wet pools that are potentially risk for having the water disappear and then melting into dry cask storage on site, and that we then shift to renewable resources of energy that are decentralized, that aren't threats for terrorism or for our communities. So that's the big story. I'm sorry to have to give the bad news in such a strong way, but I think there's actually quite a lot of positive things to take from this. And I would encourage people to continue the process of becoming educated. I think you have to realize that here in Illinois, we are the most nuclear state in the union. Okay? If we can come up with a proposal to better protect our communities, to shift that responsibility for electricity generation to renewable sources, we're going to be able to set an example for the rest of the country. So thank you for listening to me tonight, and we'll take some questions. Okay, yes.
I think about this a lot. The human race seems to have a great penchant for self-destructiveness and for suicidal behavior. And what I see with this whole business with the power of the nuclear lobby, what I see is their ability to speak above and beyond anything that's logical, anything that's reasonable, and they find ways to take a paintbrush and kind of wipe away any real anxiety. And you talk about education, but I don't think education is the answer unless we can get it right in our gut. That we really have to deal with the emotional issues of why we are so goddamn self-destructive and why we're not willing to hear reason and prevention.
Well, let me comment a little bit on this, because physicians actually were pretty active during the 80s dealing with some of the psychological issues of the arms race. And Physicians for Social Responsibility was pretty involved with dealing with things like psychic numbing and denial. And I think it's a little bit harsh to say that the folks in advocating nuclear power really are, on a suicidal bent or self-destructive. I don't think they feel that way themselves. But we clearly have a response that is not rational. And there's a great deal of fear right now. And that fear leads to a desire for a strong, supportive, masculine kind of response that Dad, please protect me. Now, big technological, nuclear power plants with cement and, it's a big, powerful sort of response saying, trust us, we'll supply you electricity, we'll do it safely. Alternate energy doesn't have that kind of sort of feeling to it. People don't realize that solar and wind and geothermal and those kinds of solutions really can provide the same kind of quality of response. And so I think it is a bit of an educational thing. People have to see the positive alternative. And I don't know if anyone heard Dr. Caldecott, Helen Caldecott, when she was here to speak earlier with the folks from Harvey Wasserman from the wind, and I can't remember the doctor speaking about solar, where it was so clear the future opportunity for building that way. I mean, if we had the Apollo mission or Manhattan Project for developing and distributing solar wind power, we could easily do that, and our houses would be healthier, our communities would be stronger, but we don't have the ability to envision that. So I think what we need to do is get away from the fear, and unfortunately, there's a great deal of fear in my presentation. I want to try to focus on the fact that we can do something about it. There are choices, and we need to make those choices clear to our neighbors and to our colleagues, and say, look, we can have safe communities. We can choose energy security such that we're not either at risk from terrorism or at risk from going to war to support our oil addiction. I think that we can leverage some of the experience of our psychiatrists and stuff to help us do that, but it's also really, side by side, it's talking to our neighbors about it.
Is there any place in the world that is prepared for this kind of thing?
Well, actually, we were talking earlier about the analysis that the United States had done, and actually, Chicago got a C+. We were like number 15 out of 50. There really were a few small communities that, quote unquote, had better preparedness. There is no preparedness for this type of a reaction, really. But we can certainly learn lessons from stronger community preparedness situations. I don't know if I could say, France, they per capita have a much higher proportion of nuclear power than we do, but we haven't had, we have 3 Mile Island, we have Chernobyl, we have examples where there isn't any preparedness. So I think we have to keep that in context of what's possible, and then work more on the prevention than preparedness.
So if you turned off all the switches,
yep,
you've still got these ponds
yep.
full of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So if you turn them all off, what would you do then?
Okay, so the first thing, I mean, the question is, well, what do we do? Because we can't just, if we just turn the switch off, we shut down the reactors. Well, the first thing we need to do is stop producing more waste, right? So shutting down the reactors or phasing them out is actually a pretty darn good idea because we don't even know what to do with the waste that we have right now. So there's no place to put this stuff. The stuff we actually do have there does need to be dealt with. Now, we've actually talked, there are some strategic things that can be done to improve the safety of the nuclear waste. One is to get them out of those ponds where they're overcrowded and dependent upon water, and you pack them into dry storage containers on site. Now, we've actually had some discussion here from Dr. Sharani. I don't know if you heard his speeches before. He's a whistleblower about he's a nuclear engineer, about these storage casks. And unfortunately, the storage casks are fraught with the same engineering problems that the nuclear plants had early on in the 70s and so on, where they're not safe, they've been overused and so on. However, they are safer than the pools themselves. So the plan should be to move the waste from those wet storage into dry storage on site. They need to actually be protected. There's been discussions about ways to keep airplanes out of there. There's ways to make sure that the buildings themselves are stronger. But right now, if we don't have any plans to get rid of that waste and there's no serious proposals for long-term storage, we've got to come up with better solutions on site. So that's the second thing. The third thing really then is, well, actually, I think that pretty much answers it for the waste.
Okay, what about a chemical plant that a plane sends a bomb into a chemical plant that has no security?
Well, that same situation applies, right? So, I mean, I think what we're talking about here is different gradations of risk. A reaction or a nuclear reactor accident or terrorism attack would greatly exceed the mortality associated with a chemical plant, although, as you know from Bhopal in India, they are also potentially a problem. But we have alternatives to nuclear power. There are a small number of those in the country right now. Chemical plants are even more distributed throughout our country, and I'm not a good expert on that, but certainly that would be another thing for us to increase. Yes?
You've stressed prevention.
Yes.
And, of course, alarm at preparedness. Do you know if the Illinois legislation effective July 2004 on disaster preparedness is at all, if the result of that is at all focused on nuclear disaster preparedness?
Yes, so there was, and actually, like the C+ was because there had been some work done by, on tabletop sort of planning for Illinois for nuclear, biological, chemical disasters. Part of the problem is we don't know what those are. And so I think one of the things we can do as communities is demand that information be made available to us. We also know that they're extremely limited in the capabilities for the response. And as we saw from the Katrina experience, the likelihood of actually being able to deploy a response in an adequate way is questionable. There are things that we know that Illinois is actually leading the country in, like, for example, these monitoring devices around the plants. I mean, that should be kind of a no-brainer, that there should be radiation monitoring devices around the plants connected automatically to City Hall or to the government's mansion, so that if in case of an accident, instantaneously people get notified. Well, citizen groups proposed to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that should be required of every nuclear plants all around the country. They refused. So, I mean, there are the things that we can actually learn from Chicago and Illinois that need to be spread to other reactors. And, clearly there's a conflict of interest, or our protection and our rights are not being addressed, whether it's tritiated nuclear water in Grundy or it's, the monitoring devices around the plants. Another, very rational suggestion was, nuclear plants require electricity. I don't know if you knew that. Even though there are nuclear plants that are making electricity, they actually need power. So if their power actually gets cut outside the nuclear plant, the plant has to shut down. Now, all of those monitoring devices around the outside of the plants require power too. So if you've got a situation that cuts the power, plant has to shut down, you have an uncontrolled shutdown, something along like Chernobyl, who's going to warn people, right? So an obvious proposal would be solar-powered devices, monitoring devices. Refused. I can't answer the question. So what I would direct you toward either the Nuclear Information Research Service or the other co-sponsor of this meeting, the Nuclear Energy Information Service, because I believe on their website they actually have quite a bit of information about these proposals. We can advocate for these, certainly. Small steps. I'll go here.
I'm curious. I know that I think a lot of the problem is, and before I got involved in environmental issues, I also felt we were being taken care of. There's an EPA, there's an Illinois EPA,
Right.
and I find that that's
Watch out.
exactly, that's not the case. And I think education is key. But who are some of the elected officials who take your message seriously, that we can count on to make sure these are people who stay in office? Because obviously this lobby, there's a stranglehold that will be difficult to impossible to overcome. So who are some of the people who are supportive of what you're talking about?
It's actually a very good question. I know on the North Shore, I'm trying to remember her name, she actually went to bat, really, for... No, Jan is certainly supportive, but... no, it wasn't Julie. I must have been...
A woman.
It's a woman, and she's on the North Shore, Highland Park sort of area, and she was the... sorry, you're right, she's a state legislature, thank you. And she was actually very active in actually getting information out about Zion and the tritiated water releases from there. So there are some, certainly, people we want to encourage. I think Representative Kirk is someone that probably needs a little push in the right direction. You know, certainly Jan Schakowsky support here, and of course our senators are actually quite supportive of this. So we do need to give them support for the work on the national level, because the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and so on is federal. But I think that the state representatives and our state legislatures actually have some reason to demand from the federal government information and protection in response to this. Now, Physicians for Social Responsibility actually intends to release a report along the lines of what's our nuclear preparedness, including not just the nuclear plant scenarios, but also a nuclear weapon, as well as a dirty bomb. That could be used by our local representatives to leverage with the federal government to get the money, to get the resources, and to get the changes necessary to help protect our community.
And there's one other thing I wanted to ask you. I had heard, and maybe you can confirm this, that after 9/11 in the state of New York, that they gave potassium iodide to people within a certain radius of nuclear plants, but that then Governor Ryan was offered it and rejected it for the people of Illinois. And can you tell us if, in fact, this is available?
First of all, I should say I'm not familiar with the specific who rejected it. I do know that that proposal was also made to the utility, because ultimately the utility is responsible for the 10-mile zones around each of the power plants for the disaster response. They, of course, refused to give out the potassium iodine because I think people start to ask questions. Well, why are you giving this to me? And I think that that's something we do have to deal with. Now, potassium iodine is not completely harmless. People do need to understand what it's used for and how appropriately to take it. But I think that our point here is that, you know, after the fact, it's no good. So we really do need people to be educated about what the real risks are. I think if people did know what their risks were, they wouldn't be choosing to have them there. I mean, the people now who are dealing with the tritiated water leaks in Grundy are saying, well, you know, I never really thought about what that meant. You know, and now they're saying, you know, I live next to a nuclear reactor. What does nuclear reactors produce? They produce radiation. You know, they're releasing, you know, radioactive, not iodine, but radioactive tritium in the water and in the air all the time. But people just aren't aware of it. So I think we do have a role in educating people so that they can start asking, is this the kind of risk that I want to have in my community? Yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering, I know this CAN TV cable is going to be showing in Chicago. I was wondering, what about the people who live right around Braidwood? How are they going to find out some of this information that they're talking about?
Well, they're actually some of the most educated people, as you might imagine. There's actually been quite a lot of effort, particularly recently, you know, with these releases, to lobby the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the EPA to deal with the situation in Grundy and around Braidwood. What we found here is, of course, that those people are complaining, but they're not being listened to. And we can certainly support them in that and you'd think that people would listen to them. But I think, and this is again not just a hypothesis, but there's sort of the not in my backyard situation where, of course, everybody wouldn't want it in their backyard, so we're not going to listen to them because we're not going to take them seriously because we just move it somewhere else or we do something else. They're going to complain too.
Yeah. What's happened at Chernobyl?
Actually, I'm not going to be able to tell you much about Chernobyl. Hopefully there'll be some other events coming through that'll give you some updates on that, although there have been some recent releases of information that contradict the World Health Organization's fairly rosy picture of the situation there now. We know that that there have been millions of people affected by that.
I saw the physicians that forecast maybe an evacuation zone of 6.5 million persons.
Right.
Have you seen any plan for the evacuation zone, or what's the largest evacuation zone that you've actually seen a plan for?
And that's actually a very good point, because the only legally required evacuation zone is 10 miles. What we see here is that the majority of the people live outside 10 miles, but clearly in the potential path of the plume. So the answer is there may be one. I haven't seen it. Certainly, we know, looking at what happened down in New Orleans, what's the likelihood that we'd be able to even do that in any kind of feasible way. I think we can demand it, or we should be demanding it. And legally, they don't have to provide that. Yes?
Has Physicians for Social Responsibility given a presentation like this to Senators Obama and Durbin?
And actually, we have talked with Senator Durbin. We have not given this exact presentation to them. Of course, I can't speak for them, but my understanding of them is that they're already supportive of this. There are other members of the Senate and our Congress who need to be educated. Physicians for Social Responsibility is now just beginning to crystallize this message in a way that can be used through communities throughout the United States. We have done a lot of education and advocacy around nuclear weapons, particularly the threat of a bunker buster. For example, this idea of using nuclear weapons against Iran. The physicians went in and actually, educated the legislature that, this is going to irradiate millions of people. This is not clean, bunker buster nuclear weapons. So we have done that in the past, and I think this is going to be the path for this information as well. Yes?
The plume that you show in your pictures, it's based on wind from the northwest.
Actually, this was wind kind of coming from the south. Yeah.
But that's assuming it's always that way, isn't it?
No, actually, we use historical data, and certainly there's the prevailing winds is actually generally that direction anyway. It is true that you never know exactly which way the winds might be blowing on that particular case. This might be considered somewhat of a worst case scenario, although the wind was only like about 10, I think I mentioned it was like 10 to 15 miles an hour. If the wind was more typical, the way it is right now, the dosage would actually be much higher, because that area that was right around only Grundy and Braidwood would actually be extended all the way to include Joliet, and you can imagine having the entire city of Joliet be exposed. Was another question? Yes?
I was just curious, what are the profits like that makes this industry so so recalcitrant, so unwilling?
Well, there's actually another whole lecture I could give on the financial basis behind this. We know that there's a tremendous amount of investment that actually goes into these plants themselves, construction, development, and so on. There's also, our tax dollars actually go to pay for insurance protection for them, the Price-Anderson Act, which basically limits or caps the nuclear plants' liability in the case of an accident. So there's all sorts of reasons why people might want to develop these sources. The one big point, big nuclear reactors that produce lots of electricity in one small place, that are centralized and have to be distributed through a grid to the United States, means you can gauge and monitor and charge for the transmission of that. Whereas most of the renewable stuff, wind, solar, these kinds of things, are distributed. No one's going to be making any bucks on the meters, because your meter is your own meter. As a matter of fact, you could even be selling your electricity back to them. So I think that there's a lot of sort of status quo vested interest in these types of centralized power production facilities with all of these protections, all of these subsidies. you know, if the renewable energy had the kinds of subsidies for development that the nuclear industry has had, you know, we would be having solar-powered cars. Thank you all for coming. I'm sorry, my voice is just about running out, but thank you guys.